If you grew up in Britain in the 50s or 60s, chances are your family didn't actually own the TV sitting in your living room. You rented it. Companies like Radio Rentals and DUR made their business out of this, and it was completely normal. The reason was simple: televisions were expensive, really expensive. A basic set in the early 50s could cost you what would be 700 quid in today's money, which most families just didn't have lying about. So instead you'd pay a few shillings a week, maybe half a crown, and a bloke from the rental shop would deliver the set to your house. The big advantage was that if it broke down, which happened fairly often with all those valves and circuits inside, the company would fix it for free or swap it out. You could also trade up to a newer model when one came along, which people did when colour broadcasts started in the late 60s. For most of the 70s and into the 80s, British households had exactly 3 television channels to choose from: BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. That was it, your entire selection. No remote control either, so changing the channel meant getting up, walking over to the set, and turning the dial yourself. Most families owned just one television, which meant viewing was a shared experience whether you liked it or not. After tea, the entire family would gather round in the living room, and whoever was in charge, usually your parents, picked which channel stayed on. If Dad wanted the news on BBC One, everyone watched the news on BBC One. You could complain, but it rarely changed anything. The upside was that the next day at school or work, there was a good chance the person you were talking to had watched the same program you did. Television was communal in a way it simply isn't anymore. Most homes in Britain during the 1940s and 50s had just one coal fire, and that fire lived in the living room. The rest of the house stayed freezing because coal was expensive and lighting fires in multiple rooms was considered wasteful. Bedrooms had fireplaces, but they only got lit if someone was seriously ill. This meant waking up to proper Arctic conditions every winter morning. You would see ice on the inside of your bedroom windows, actual frost patterns formed overnight from the moisture in your breath. Parents told children it was Jack Frost decorating the windows, which was a nice way to spin absolutely miserable conditions. Getting out of a warm bed into that freezing air was brutal. Most children learned to dress under the covers, wriggling into cold clothes while still wrapped in blankets. You would rush downstairs to stand near the living room fire, which had usually been going since early morning. The kitchen might get some heat if someone left the gas oven on with the door open. In working-class neighbourhoods, most homes had their toilet outside in the backyard well into the 1950s. These outdoor loos went by all sorts of names: the lavvy, privy, thunderbox, bog, whatever you fancied. The typical setup was a small brick or wooden hut tucked beside the coal house, just a few steps from the back door. Inside you'd find whitewashed brick walls, a wooden seat with a hole cut through it, and that was it. There was no electricity out there, which meant no light and no heat whatsoever. During the day, a gap at the top and bottom of the door let in enough daylight, but at night you were heading out in pitch darkness. In winter, it was absolutely freezing. In summer, it stank. Some terraced houses had communal toilets shared between 2 or 3 families, which made privacy tricky. These loos needed regular upkeep, emptying the pit underneath, and adding lime or ash to keep the smell down. Bath night happened once a week in British households, typically Sunday evening, so everyone would be clean for the week ahead. The reason was simple: heating water cost money and took considerable effort. Even homes with indoor plumbing were careful because electricity was expensive, and people remembered when water had to be carried in buckets and heated over coal fires. You had to fill the copper in the scullery, light it, wait for it to heat, then bail the hot water into buckets and carry them to wherever the bath was. For many families, this meant a tin bath in front of the kitchen range. The real economy measure was sharing bath water. Father went first, then mother, then the children from oldest to youngest. By the time the last child climbed in, the water was grey, lukewarm, and had a scummy film floating on top, but that was simply how it worked. Corner shops ran a credit system that kept working-class families going between paydays. The shopkeeper kept a ledger, writing down whatever you bought throughout the week. People called it putting things on tick or on the slate. Your bread, milk, and packets of tea went into the book with your name at the top. Come Friday, when wages arrived, you'd settle the amount. If money was tight, some shopkeepers let you pay part and put the rest to the back of the book. These transactions created relationships between families and corner shops. Your local shopkeeper knew your family, knew when times were hard, knew who could be trusted. Children got sent with notes saying mum needed this or that on tick, and the shopkeeper decided whether to allow it. This mutual dependence bound communities together, even if it left some families perpetually in debt. Monday was wash day across Britain, and this was absolutely set in stone. You started at 5 or 6 in the morning, and the whole day was taken up with it. Meals were cold leftovers from the Sunday roast because there was no time to cook when wrestling with wet laundry. The copper in the scullery got lit first thing to heat water, filled bucket by bucket from the single cold tap. Whites got boiled with carbolic soap and washing soda, while the colours soaked separately in a wooden tub. Once everything was washed and rinsed, it went through the mangle. This was a heavy cast iron contraption with 2 rollers you cranked by hand, squeezing the water out into a tin bath underneath. Your arms ached by the end. Then came hanging out if the weather was decent. Clothes went on lines in the backyard or strung across the street, following strict rules about what hung where. Before the 1980s, every kid was what we now call free range. You'd leave the house in the morning, wander wherever you wanted, and had to be home when the streetlights came on. That was the rule. Parents didn't track you, didn't know where you were, and didn't worry about it. Kids walked to school alone from age 5 or 6, played in parks without adults hovering, explored wasteland and construction sites, rode bikes miles from home. You made up your own games, sorted out your own arguments, took risks, and learned from them. There were no playdates, no organised activities. The community kept a loose eye. A neighbour might yell at you for being stupid, but mostly you were left to get on with it. Parents trusted that if something really bad happened, someone would step in. This kind of independence is almost unthinkable now, but back then it was just normal childhood. Fresh milk arrived on your doorstep every morning before sunrise. The milkman drove an electric float that hummed quietly through dark streets, carrying glass bottles in wire crates that clinked softly as he walked up each garden path. Every bottle had a silver foil cap on top, and underneath you could see the cream forming a thick layer through the glass. He knew each family's order by heart: 3 pints for the Smiths, 2 for the Johnsons, 1 gold top for Mrs. Davies next door. No lists needed, no mistakes, just memory. He worked 7 days a week in all weather, and homes depended on him completely because most people didn't have fridges yet. Winter mornings brought something special with those bottles left outside overnight. The cream would freeze solid and push the foil cap upward, creating a little silver mushroom shape on top of the bottle. You'd collect them from the step, still freezing cold, and bring them inside for breakfast. The local pub was where working-class men went after their shifts ended. This was their social centre, the place where the day's grime got washed away with cheap beer and conversation. You'd find men from the factory or the docks crowded around tables, pints in hand, talking about work or football, or just letting the day fade away. The beer was affordable because it had to be. These weren't wealthy men, and the pub knew its customers. A pint cost pennies, enough to keep a man coming back without draining his wage packet. Women had their own arrangements. Some pubs set aside specific nights for them, usually midweek when things were quieter. Others had separate lounges, partitioned off from the main bar where the men gathered. It wasn't about exclusion exactly, more about how things were done. Meanwhile, the children waited outside with bottles of lemonade and packets of crisps, sitting on the curb or playing in the street, while their parents had their hour of peace inside. Before everyone carried a watch, factory sirens regulated entire neighborhoods. The sound was loud enough to reach several blocks in every direction, and it carried specific instructions. When the 7 a.m. blast went off, streets filled with workers heading toward the factories. The same pattern repeated at 5 p.m. when the shift ended, except in reverse. The siren meant time to move, and everyone responded. These were not gentle reminders. A steam whistle could hit 150 decibels, louder than a chainsaw. The tone cut through walls and weather. Workers knew what each signal meant without checking a clock. 1 long blast at noon meant lunch break. 2 short blasts 5 minutes before the hour meant wrap up. The entire community synchronized around these sounds, even if they did not work at the factory themselves. Shopkeepers knew when customers would appear. Wives knew when to have dinner ready. Children knew when their fathers would be walking home. The sirens structured behavior across entire working-class districts. Families in the 1950s and 60s repaired everything rather than replacing it, partly because wartime make-do and mend habits had stuck, and mostly because money was tight. Skills passed from mothers to daughters as standard. If your sock developed a hole, your mum would darn it using a wooden darning mushroom and matching thread. The mushroom went inside the sock, and you wove thread back and forth across the hole, building up a little fabric patch. Shirt collars that frayed got turned, which meant unpicking the collar, flipping it around, and sewing it back on with the worn bit hidden inside. Old jumpers got unraveled, and the wool re-knitted after being wound around a glass bottle, wetted and dried to remove the kinks. Worn cotton underwear became dusters and floor cloths. Furniture got glued and reglued, chair seats recaned or rest-stuffed with whatever was lying about. Shoes went to the cobbler for new heels and soles multiple times before anyone considered them finished. Making things last wasn't some eco-friendly choice. It was just how you managed when every penny counted and new things cost proper money. Council estates were social housing projects where working-class families lived in blocks of flats or rows of houses built around shared green spaces and community facilities. These places had a particular rhythm to them. Neighbors knew each other by name, knew which kids belonged to which flat, knew who was having a hard time and who had just got their wages. If you needed a cup of sugar or some milk, you knocked on the door next to yours and borrowed it without thinking twice about it. The kids from different households played together constantly, running between flats, riding their bikes around the estate, making up games in the stairwells and on the communal patches of grass. Your mum could send you outside to play knowing that several other adults would keep an eye on you whether you wanted them to or not. People looked out for each other, helped when times were hard, and generally operated as one extended community rather than separate households living side by side. The estate was not just where you lived, but who you lived with, and everyone knew everybody else's business. The 3-day week kicked off on 1st of January 1974 and lasted for 2 months. It came about because coal miners were striking over wages, and with coal supplies to power stations running low, the government decided non-essential businesses could only operate Monday to Wednesday or Thursday to Saturday. Homes got rationed power as well. Newspapers published blackout schedules and families planned their entire day around them. You'd check the paper to see when your area was due to lose electricity, then schedule cooking, homework, bathing around those hours. Candles became essential household items overnight. People also stocked up on gas heaters, paraffin lamps, and camping stoves. Some homes went without power for up to 9 hours in a day. It sounds dramatic, but most people just got on with it, adapting their routines week after week. One woman described having to leave work early because offices had no lights, whilst another recalled theatres handing torches to audience members in the front row so plays could continue when the lights cut out mid-performance. Friday night at the chip shop was a ritual working families counted on from the late 1800s onward. You would queue up after work, sometimes 15 or 20 minutes, watching the cod or haddock being battered and lowered into bubbling fat. The smell alone made your stomach growl. This tradition started with Jewish immigrants who brought fried fish to Britain in the 16th century. Then someone added chips around 1860. The whole thing wrapped in newspaper, kept it hot on the walk home and gave you something to read while you ate. For working families, this was affordable luxury. A hot meal you didn't have to cook after a long week. A portion cost just a few pence and fed the whole family. Friday meant no red meat for Catholic families, so fish fitted perfectly. The chippy became the place you saw your neighbours, had a chat, let someone else do the cooking. It was never fancy, but it was dependable and hot, and everyone loved it. For working-class families in Britain from the late 19th century onwards, the annual week at the seaside was the year's highlight. Mill workers in Lancashire saved for months in going off clubs, putting aside pennies to afford train fare and boarding house. The Holidays with Pay Act in 1938 made workers get paid for their week off, but before that you saved all year or didn't go. Different towns took different weeks to spread the crowds at Blackpool or Morecambe. Families stayed in boarding houses near the station with boxes and bags of food. For many, this was their first time seeing the sea. Days were spent on the beach with donkey rides and Punch and Judy shows, eating candy floss and fish and chips, playing in amusement arcades with penny slots, and what the butler saw machines. The promenade had stalls selling seaside rock and buckets and spades. It wasn't fancy, but it was freedom from the mills for one precious week. When money got tight in working-class neighborhoods, something interesting happened. Not charity programs or government schemes stepping in, but neighbors just sorting things out amongst themselves. If your family had a bit extra at the end of the week, you'd make a bigger pot of stew and send portions round to 3 or 4 households. No one asked for receipts or kept score. Next month, when you were the one struggling, food would arrive at your door the same way. Childcare worked similarly. Parents would rotate who minded the kids after school, creating informal networks where every adult on the street was effectively watching everyone's children. This wasn't just practical, it was efficient. One mum could supervise 8 kids in the playground, whilst the other parents worked late shifts. These arrangements created bonds that lasted decades. People who grew up in these communities often talk about having multiple aunties and uncles who weren't blood relations but were family in every way that mattered.